Mr. President.
Senator from Iowa.
Mr. President, I ask that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, parliamentary inquiry under the unanimous consent agreement agreed to previously. There was a period of 30 minutes for tributes to Senator Mikulski. Is there any of that time remaining?
Time has been consumed, sir.
I appreciate that. And now, if I'm not mistaken, under the unanimous consent request, then I was deemed to have 45 minutes.
That is correct.
I appreciate the chair. First of all, then, Mr. President, I have a resolution for myself, Senator Durbin, Senator Mikulski, and Senator Shaheen, which I send to the desk and ask for its immediate consent.
Without objection.
Mr. President. Mr. President.
The clerk will read the resolution by title.
Mr. President.
Wait.
Resolution amending the standing rules of the Senate to provide for cloture to be invoked with less than 3/5 majority after additional debate.
Mr. President.
Is there objection?
Mr. President, reserving the right to object.
Senator from Tennessee.
I've had a good discussion with the senator from Iowa. This is a long-standing proposal of his, which has been, he's thoughtfully considered it. Even though I admire him, I don't admire the proposal. And so what we would like to do is let the senator from Iowa make his proposal. I'll listen, and then when he's made the proposal, I will ask him to yield me a few minutes, and we may have a little discussion back and forth on the merits of the proposal. So with that in mind, I object.
Objection having been heard. Resolution will go over under the rules.
Okay. Well, Mr. President, thank you, and I'm sorry that my good friend from Tennessee had to object, but I understand that. And now, Mr. President, we are going to engage for some time now on the Senate floor in a discussion on the filibuster. On the filibuster. Something that has been around a long time, but which in the last several years, few years, I wouldn't say several, last 20, 30 years, has gotten to the point which it has paralyzed the United States Senate and has really paralyzed the country. So I intend to make some remarks here for a while. I appreciate my friend from Tennessee and my friend from Kansas who's here, and I hope that we can engage in a nice colloquy and a discussion about this in a back-and-forth way, and I look forward to doing that. But I did want to take some time to at least lay out my case, as I did 16 years ago. On January the 4th of 1995, I introduced this same resolution. And I found myself as a member of the minority party in the Senate at that time for the first time in 8 years. However, when I first came to the Senate, the Republicans were in charge, and then the Democrats got in charge, and then the Republicans got in charge, and then the Democrats got in charge, and then the Republicans got in charge, and then the Democrats got in charge. So since I've been here since 1985, 5 times the Senate has changed hands. And I note that at the beginning of that Congress in 1995, the Republicans outnumbered Democrats 53 to 47, the same majority-minority ratio that exists today, just on the other side. But even though I was opposed to the then-majority party's agenda, I introduced this same basic resolution to change the Senate rules regarding the filibuster. My plan would have ensured ample debate and deliberation, the stated purpose of a filibuster, to have debate and deliberation. But it would also have allowed a bill or nominee to receive a yes or no vote. Now, unfortunately, my proposal didn't pass, got 19 votes. My co-sponsors then were Senator Lieberman, Senator Pell, and Senator Robb of Virginia. I introduced my bill, and if you care to go back and read that debate, it's the January 4th, 1995 congressional record in the Senate. I saw an escalating arms race where each side ratcheted up the use of the filibuster. That's what I called it then. And sadly, in the intervening years, my prediction has been fulfilled. The sad reality is that today, because of the indiscriminate use of the filibuster, the ability of our government to legislate and to address problems is severely jeopardized. 16 years after I first introduced my proposal, it's even more apparent that for our government to properly function, we must reform and curb the use of the filibuster. Mr. President, the filibuster was once an extraordinary tool used in the rarest of circumstances. When many people think of the filibuster, many times it brings to mind the classic film of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. But it's ironic that in 1939, the year that Frank Capra filmed Mr. Smith, there were 0 filibusters in the Senate. From 1917, across the entire 19th century, for 100 years, there were 23 filibusters in 100 years. Indeed, through 1879, there were only 4. From 1917, when the Senate first adopted rules to end the filibuster, until 1969, there were fewer than 50, less than 1 filibuster a year. Unfortunately, since then, the number has skyrocketed. So the current concerns I raised today are not new. The problem has become far more serious. In 1982, my good friend and colleague, Senator Dale Bumpers of Arkansas, said this about the filibuster. He said, unless, quote, unless we recognize that things are out of control and procedures have to be changed, we'll never be an effective legislative body again. 1982. During the 2 years of that Congress, there were 31 filibusters. 31 filibusters, as measured by the number of cloture motions filed. In 1985, former Senator Thomas Eagleton of Missouri remarked, quote, the Senate is now in the state of incipient anarchy. The filibuster, once used by and large as an occasional exercise in civil rights matters, has now become a routine frolic in almost all matters. Whereas our rules were devised to guarantee full and free debate, they now guaranteed unbridled chaos. Unbridled chaos, end quote. That was 1985, my first year here. But during that Congress, there were 40 filibusters. Now, again, I want to refer to this number of filibusters as a visual aid to see what's happened. As we go back here to the 88th, the 90th, 91st, on up, you can see the number of filibusters escalating from less than 10 a year, 4 or 5, up to almost 140, 136 and 139. In 1994, former Republican Senator Charles Mathias of Maryland said, quote, today filibusters are far less visible but far more frequent. The filibuster has become an epidemic. An epidemic. That's former Republican Senator Charles Mathias. Used whenever a coalition can find 41 votes to oppose legislation. Listen to what he said. The distinction between voting against legislation and blocking a vote, between opposing and obstructing, has nearly disappeared. End quote. Senator Mathias of Maryland. But again, during that Congress, again, right before I first introduced the legislation to modify the filibuster, there were 80 filibusters that year. And if I might quote myself what I said 1 year after Senator Mathias made his statement. I said about the filibuster, and this is what I said in 1995. I said it is used, Mr. President, as blackmail for one senator to get his or her way on something they could not rightfully win through the normal process. I'm not accusing any one party of this. It happens on both sides of the aisle. I said that in 1995. I'm quoting myself from the record. Mr. President, I believe each senator needs to give up a little of our pride, a little of our prerogatives, and a little of our power for the good of this Senate and for the good of this country. I think the voters of this country were turned off by the constant bickering, the arguing back and forth that goes on in this Senate chamber, the gridlock that ensued here, the pointing of fingers of blame. Sometimes in the fog of debate, like the fog of war, it is hard to determine who is responsible for slowing something down. It's like shifting sand. People hide behind the filibuster. I think it is time to let the voters know that we heard their message in the last election. I said this in 1995. They did not send us here to bicker and to argue, to point fingers. They want us to get things done, to address the concerns facing this country. They want us to reform this place. They want this place to operate a little better, a little more openly, and a little more decisively. I said that when the Republicans were in charge. But with all of those filibusters, it wasn't really until the 110th and 111th Congress that the true scope of the filibuster abuse would be truly realized. In the 110th Congress, there were an astonishing 139 motions to end filibusters. In the 111th, there was 136. 275 filibusters in just 4 years. The fact is, in successive Congresses, Democrats and Republicans alike have made the filibuster an everyday weapon of obstruction. Not as a way to ensure debate and deliberation, but as a way of obstruction. And I say both sides have done it. I said that in 1995. I predicted an escalating arms race. I said if we don't do something about it, it's going to get worse. And unfortunately, it has. On almost a daily basis, one senator is able to use just the threat of a filibuster to stop bills from even coming to the floor for debate and amendment. In the past Congress, we started seeing the minority filibuster bills they didn't even object to, solely in order to slow down unrelated measures that they did oppose. The result is a legislative process that is simply overwhelmed, squeezing out the ability to do important, relatively non-controversial legislation. It is no accident that Norm Ornstein, the esteemed congressional scholar, wrote an article titled Our Broken Senate, in which he wrote that, quote, the expanded use of formal rules on Capitol Hill is unprecedented and is bringing the government to its knees. Just the other day, Mr. President, I received a petition signed by nearly 300 top historians, legal scholars, and political scientists urging senators, quote, to restore majority rule to the United States Senate, end quote. And I ask unanimous consent that this petition be printed at this point in the record.
Without objection.
Last month, our former colleagues, Gary Hart, a Democrat, Chuck Hagel, a Republican, published an essay in Time magazine calling on us to, quote, restore democracy to the U.S. Senate by reforming the filibuster. In their words, the abuse of the filibuster is no way to govern a great democracy. Mr. President, I ask that that essay be printed at this point in the record.
Without objection.
Editorials from across the country have recognized that the filibuster must end. The Concord Monitor of New Hampshire recently called on the Senate to, quote, remove the Senate filibuster roadblock, noting that, quote, the filibuster rule has rendered the Senate dysfunctional and harmed the nation's ability to deal with pressing issues. The Los Angeles Times said that, quote, both parties should be willing to eliminate such anti-democratic practices as the filibuster, end quote. Mr. President, editorials throughout the country have called for reform of the filibuster. And again, I ask unanimous consent for them to be entered at this point in the record.
Without objection.
275 filibusters in 4 years is not just a cold statistic. It represents the minority blocking measures sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, that enjoy broad support among the American people. Just in the last Congress, the filibuster was used to kill many bills that enjoyed majority and often bipartisan support. Need I mention the DREAM Act? Had bipartisan support, had big support among the American people. Or the Disclose Act, which polls showed that over 80% of the American people supported. And we had a majority vote here for it, we just didn't have a supermajority. So it's no surprise that Americans are fed up and angry with their federal government. In too many critical areas, people see a legislature that is simply unable to respond effectively to the most urgent challenges of our time. And make no mistake, the problem goes beyond the sheer number of filibusters. For this once rare tactic is now used or threatened to be used on virtually every measure and nominee, even those that may enjoy near universal support. In the past Congress, for nearly 8 months, the minority filibustered confirmation of Martha Johnson as Administrator of the General Services Administration. Certainly a relatively non-controversial position. She was ultimately confirmed 96-0. So what was that filibuster all about? And for nearly 5 months, the minority filibustered confirmation of Barbara Keenan to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. She was ultimately confirmed 99-0. What was that filibuster all about? Again, to quote Norm Ornstein, quote, the Senate has taken the term deliberative to a new level, slowing not just contentious legislation, but also bills that have overwhelming support. Now, secondly, Mr. President, filibuster has increasingly been used to prevent consideration of bills and nominees, rather than to serve to ensure that the representation of minority views and to foster debate and deliberation. By filibustering motions to proceed, the minority has been allowed to prevent debate and prevent deliberation. The filibuster has been used to defeat bills and nominees without their ever receiving a discussion here on the floor of the Senate. In other words, the Senate, which was formerly renowned as the world's greatest deliberative body, has now become the world's greatest non-deliberative body. We can't even debate important national issues. That's why I fully support the common sense proposals to reform the filibuster, restore the Senate to one where issues can be fully debated and deliberated. I support eliminating the filibuster on the motion to proceed. And I believe those who are filibustering a bill or nominee should be required to come to the floor, hold the floor, make their case to the colleagues of the American people. Senators should not be able to hide behind a curtain of secret holds. But the reality is, however, that because of the filibuster, the minority has unchecked veto power in this body. Now, Mr. President, I want to make it clear, when I say the minority, I'm not talking about Republicans. I'm talking about the minority. It may be the Democrats and it may be the Republicans. As I said 5 times, it's changed since I've been here since 1985. When I say the minority, I mean the minority. I don't mean a political party. As James Madison noted, when rejecting a supermajority requirement to pass legislation, here's what James Madison said, quote, "If you had a supermajority," he said, quote, "it would no longer be the majority that would rule, the power would be transferred to the minority." That's James Madison. Unfortunately, Madison's prediction has come true. We are the only Democratic body that I know of in the world where the minority, not the majority, controls. In today's Senate, American democracy is turned on its head. The minority rules, the majority is blocked. The majority has responsibility and accountability, but lacks the power to govern. The minority has power, but lacks accountability and responsibility. This means that the minority can block bills that would improve the economy, create jobs, and turn around and blame the majority for not fixing the economy. The minority could block popular legislation and then accuse the majority of being ineffective. And again, I repeat, when I say the minority, I'm not saying Republicans or Democrats. I'm saying the minority, whoever it may happen to be here. Both parties have abused the filibuster in the past, and both will, absent real reform, abuse the filibuster in the future. Though Republicans are currently in the minority, there is no question that control of this body will change, as it periodically does. The fact is, reform is urgently needed. And that's why I'm reintroducing my proposal again, which would permit a decreasing majority of senators over a period of days to invoke cloture on a given matter. Under my proposal, a determined minority could slow down any bill. Senators would have ample time to make their arguments and attempt to persuade the public and a majority of their colleagues. This protects the rights of the minority to full and vigorous debate and deliberation, maintaining the hallmark of the United States Senate. But at the end of ample debate, the majority should be allowed to act. There should be an up or down vote on legislation or a nominee. As former Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, a Republican, stated many years ago, quote, "To vote without debating is perilous, but to debate and never vote is imbecile." My plan has another advantage. The fact is, right now, the minority has no incentive to compromise. Not only do they know that they have the power to block legislation, but they can go out and campaign on the message that the majority can't get anything done. In contrast, if the minority knows at the end of a period of time a bill or nominee is subject to majority vote, they'll be more willing to come to the table and negotiate seriously. Likewise, the majority would want to compromise because they want to save time. There's nothing more valuable to the majority party in the Senate than time. So, under my proposal, On the first cloture vote, you would need 60 votes. If you didn't have 60 votes, you could have another vote. In 3 days, you need 57 votes. 3 more days, 54 votes. 3 more days, 51 votes. So a majority would finally act. But you would chew up almost 2 weeks of time. So if on the first vote, let's say 53 senators voted for cloture, well, the minority would know that in several days, or maybe in a couple of weeks' time, 53 senators will get cloture. Well, the minority then would go to the majority and say, look, we can drag this out for a couple of weeks, chew up all your time, but we've got some things that we would like to have considered. The majority, and I say there's nothing more important to the majority than time here, not wanting to spend a couple of weeks on a bill, on a cloture, on a filibuster, would say, okay, maybe we can make an agreement, we'll collapse the time frame, the minority gets some of the things they want, the majority is able then to have a vote. So I see my proposal as a means of encouraging compromise. Right now, there is no reason to compromise for the minority. And again, I repeat, I'm not talking about Republicans or Democrats. I say the minority, because they know they can absolutely block it. Now, I want to say one thing also, and I want to say that I have changed my resolution since I introduced it in 1995. And I've changed it because Republicans have said that, and I heard the minority leader say earlier that they've done this because Democrats in the majority this time, have employed procedural matters to deprive the Republicans of the right to offer amendments. Well, I'm very sympathetic to this argument. And that's why I included in this resolution a guaranteed right to offer germane amendments to the minority, filed in advance of the cloture vote, so everyone would know what was coming. So again, the minority should have the right to offer some amendments that are germane to the bill. I think one of the reasons that both, no matter who the majority is, that are perhaps concerned about the amendments from the minority is that you have a bill dealing with housing and someone wants to offer a bill dealing with abortion, an amendment. Well, there may be a time and a place for that, but not on that bill. And so that's why I say it should be germane to the bill. If the minority has ideas on how to improve the bill, strike something from the bill, it ought to be germane to that bill. Now, I've heard it said, and I heard it on the radio this morning driving in, that this is something like a power grab by a Democratic senator reacting to recent elections in which my party lost numerous seats. Well, I want to make clear that the reforms I advocate are not about one party or one agenda gaining an unfair advantage. It's about the Senate as an institution operating more fairly, effectively, and democratically. Again, I want to point out, I first offered this in 1995 when I was in the minority. So to use a legal term, I come here with clean hands. The truth is, with Republicans controlling the House, any final legislation will need to be bipartisan, with or without the filibuster. So reform of the filibuster, I don't see it as a Democrat or Republican issue. Indeed, it was the former Republican Majority Leader, Senator Frist, who said when he nearly shut this body down over the use of filibusters on a handful of judges, quote, he said, "This filibuster is nothing less than a formula for tyranny by the minority." 2004, Senator Frist, the Republican leader, Majority Leader at that time. Well, as I said, now one of the problems here was this was done in the middle of the term. See, I think the Senate ought to be able to set its rules at the beginning, on the first legislative day, which we're in now and which will extend for some time, that the Senate ought to be able to set its rules at the beginning for that Congress. Now, you can't go changing the rules every month, but you should be able to set the rules at the beginning of a Congress so you know for 2 years what the rules are that you're operating under. So again, it's time for the arms race to end. That's what this is. It's an arms race. And I dare say, if we don't do anything about this, if the Republicans take control of the Senate, as they think they will in 2 years, well, Democrats are going to do the same thing to them. Guarantee it. Guarantee it. And it will, the Republicans did what I say, 136 filibusters and 139. Bet your bottom dollar, if we don't change the rules, Democrats will match them. You wait and see. Well, a lot of people sometimes say, well, hearken, what you're advocating is that the Senate would become like the House. Since when, I ask my friends, and any senator on both sides of the aisle, since when did the Senate become defined by Rule 22, which is the filibuster? Why does that define the Senate? I thought the Senate was defined by the fact that you get 2 senators from every state. 2 senators from North Dakota, 2 senators from California, 2 senators from New York, 2 senators from Iowa. I thought the Senate was defined by the fact that we have unlimited debate here. When a senator gets the floor, you can't take it away from him. We operate on unanimous consent. The power of one single senator would remain. But the Senate, what do? We do treaties. We do nominations. We sit in judgment on impeachment. The Senate was not like the House. And just because we don't have a filibuster as we've known it for the last 93 years, 94 years, does not mean that the Senate becomes like the House. Eliminating the filibuster will not change the basic nature of the United States Senate. So I say to those who say that the Senate would be like the House if we did away with this filibuster, would they also suggest that the Senate of Henry Clay or Daniel Webster or Lyndon Johnson or Everett Dirksen was the same as the House of Representatives? I don't think so. The fact is, what was never intended was that a supermajority of 60 votes would be needed to enact virtually any piece of legislation or confirm any nominee. In fact, the framers of the Constitution were very clear about where a supermajority is required. There were only 5 in the original Constitution: ratification of a treaty, override of a veto, votes of impeachment, passage of a constitutional amendment, and expulsion of a member. Now, if they wanted to have supermajorities, they would have said so. But it's not in the Constitution. The filibuster is not in the Constitution. The first Senate expressly included a rule permitting the majority to end debate and bring a measure to a vote by moving the previous question. I repeat, the first Senate had a rule that permitted the majority to end debate. Alexander Hamilton explained that a supermajority requirement would mean that a small minority could destroy the energy of government. Hamilton said that the government would be subject to the caprice or artifices of an insignificant, turbulent, or corrupt junta. Hamilton's words. Moreover, reform of filibuster rules meet squarely within the tradition of updating Senate rules as needed to foster an effective government that can respond to the challenges of the day. The Senate has adopted rules that forbid the filibuster in certain cases, such as the War Powers Act and the budget. Imagine that. What should be more debatable than the budget? But our rules do not permit a filibuster of the budget. So we passed rules here limiting the filibuster. Since 1917, we have passed 4 significant reforms concerning the filibuster. The fact is, as Senator Tom Udall has powerfully made clear, Article 1, Section 5, Clause 2 of the Constitution specifies, quote, each House may determine the rules of its proceedings. As Senator Robert Byrd, who was opposed to filibuster reform, and he and I had a great debate back in 1995 on this, as he emphasized, and he said this, Senator Byrd, he said at any time that 51 senators are determined to change the rule, that rule can be changed. End quote. And I'm reading here from what Senator Byrd said. He said at that time, he said, the Constitution in Article 1, Section 5 says that each House shall determine the rules of its proceedings. Now we are at the beginning of Congress. This Congress, he said, is not obliged to be bound by the dead hand of the past. The dead hand. I listened to the minority leader when he said that we haven't, the majority has never changed rules except by following those rules. Well, the rules set down by a Congress a long time ago, by a Senate a long time ago, said that in order to change the rules, you need two-thirds of a vote of the Senate. I submit that's unconstitutional. And I submit that this Congress, this Senate, on this first legislative day, doesn't have to abide by that. Well, what if one party got 90 senators one time and they adopted a rule that said from here on out you had to have 90 votes in order to change rules. And here are the rules, and they set up rules that pretty much made it impossible for the minority to ever become the majority. Would that be constitutional? I don't think so. Senator Byrd said we're not obliged to be bound by the dead hand of the past. The first Senate, Senator Byrd said, which met in 1789, approved 19 rules by majority vote. Those rules have been changed from time to time. So the members of the Senate who met in 1789 and approved that first body of rules did not for one moment think or believe or pretend that all succeeding Senates would be bound by that Senate. And here is the essence of what Senator Byrd said. He said, "It is my belief, which has been supported by rulings of vice presidents of both parties and by votes of the Senate, in essence, upholding the power and right of a majority of the Senate to change the rules of the Senate at the beginning of a new Congress." Well, I would say that Byrd has not been alone in his views or his tactics. The constitutional option has been endorsed by 3 vice presidents and 3 times by the Senate itself. So why wasn't it used? Because senators then reached a compromise. And therefore we never had the constitutional option. But that doesn't mean that we can't use that. The Constitution is very clear. And I think 3 votes of the Senate and 3 former vice presidents have made clear in their rulings that at the beginning of a Congress, we can set the rules. Well, Mr. President, Chief Justice John Marshall once said that any enduring Constitution must be able to respond to the various crises of human affairs. I've said many times, I don't believe that we can be a 21st century superpower bound by archaic rules of the 19th century. We have to have a responsive government, responding to the challenges of our time. I'm not afraid. I say to my friends on the Republican side, I am not afraid. What the minority leader said, he said that sometime that the Republicans might be in charge and they might want to undo what the Democrats did, and the Democrats better be careful. Well, that was in his op-ed piece in the Post this morning. I'm not afraid of democracy. I'm not afraid of the votes of the people. If the people vote to put certain conservatives in power, then they ought to have the right to govern. They ought to have the right to respond to the people of this country. The minority, if I would be in the minority at that time, I think the minority ought to have the right to be heard. We'd have the right to debate. We ought to have the right to amend. But we should not have the right to totally obstruct. I'm not afraid. People say the Tea Party in the House, they're going to do all this stuff. I'm sorry, I'm not afraid. People voted. There ought to be things that happen because people vote a certain way. No wonder so many people are frustrated. They vote and they think things are going to happen. They don't happen. They say, a pox on both your houses. So yes, I don't know why we should be so afraid of each other. Why should I be afraid that the Republicans are going to institute legislation that I don't like? They have in the past, and our country has endured. And I would say that there are times when the Democrats have passed legislation Republicans don't like, and our country has endured. So I just don't like this thing of fear, that we have to be afraid that somehow the majority is going to do things. Now, what we want to make sure of is that the rights of the minority are guaranteed to be heard, that the rights of the minority to offer amendments, but I don't think it ought to be the right of the minority to obstruct, and I don't think it ought to be the right of the minority to demand that their views be implemented. That's the right of the majority. So I close by kind of where I began, Mr. President, and I thank my senators, my friends, for this indulgence. The bedrock of the principle, I believe, of our Constitution, our founders, was majority rule with respect for minority rights. But I say this, and I've said it many times, it's kind of the dirty little secret of the United States Senate. And here's the dirty little secret. The power of an individual senator comes not by what we can do, but by what we can stop. That's the dirty little secret of the Senate. One senator can stop something, can block it. Well, I say that each senator needs to give up a little of our privilege, give up a little of our power, give up a little of our prerogative for the greater good of this country. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
President from Tennessee. Mr.
President,
from Tennessee.
I thank the senator from Iowa for his consistency over the years with his proposal. I wonder if I could make a few remarks on his proposal, and if he has time, if he's still here, maybe I'll pose a question to him. I see the senator from Kansas is also here. He spent a lot of time on the Rules Committee on the subject, one of our most forceful speakers on the matter, and I would defer to him. And then I know there are other senators, a senator from Oregon, senator from New Mexico have some proposals to offer, so I'll wait for those proposals then to be offered, and there may be other senators on the Republican side come to the floor. But the few remarks first, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that an address that I made yesterday at the Heritage Foundation entitled "The Filibuster, Democracy's Finest Show, the Right to Talk Your Head Off," that be put in the congressional record.
Without objection.
I borrowed those words from H.V. Kaltenborn, and Mr. Smith goes to Washington. I'm a little amused by the suggestion that the senator from Iowa made and others have made that somehow the Senate's been paralyzed for the last couple of years. Most of the people I know are concerned about what the Senate did, not what it didn't do. I mean, it's hard to say you're paralyzed when you pass $1 trillion stimulus bill, a big health care law, a financial regulation law, et cetera, et cetera. And so far as Republicans, or the minority, as he's been careful to say, holding things up, you know, we didn't have a budget last year. Most households have to have budgets. We ought to have one. Why didn't we have a budget? It wasn't Republicans. As the senator from Iowa said, under our law, rules, it only takes 51 votes to pass a budget. And during the last couple of years, the Democrats had 59 or 60 votes. So it was the reason we didn't have a budget is because they didn't want to pass a budget, or at least they didn't pass a budget. It had nothing to do with the Senate being, quote, broken. The senator from Iowa made this proposal he's made some modifications in it, but basically this proposal in 1995. I remember those days pretty well. That's when, that was right after the so-called Gingrich Revolution in 1994. Republicans took control of the Senate and of the House. So the senator from Iowa made his proposal to diminish the effectiveness of a filibuster. And what did the Republicans do? The Republicans who had the most to gain, at least temporarily, from being able to get their agenda through the Senate, every single one voted no. Every single Republican senator in 1995 said, no, we may love our agenda, but we don't want to change the Senate. We don't want to jeopardize the Senate as a forum for forcing consensus and protecting minority rights and letting the voices of all of the people be heard on the Senate floor. not only the Republican senators in 1995 said that, here are some things that were said mostly in 2005 by Democratic leaders. There were some Republicans who got this idea, the same idea that the senator from Iowa has, about diminishing the effectiveness of the filibuster. In this case, it was on judicial nominations. It was great consternation because Democrats had decided to filibuster President Bush's judges. I didn't like that either. But this is what was said then. Senator Robert Byrd, we must never, ever, ever tear down the only wall, the necessary fence this nation has against the excesses of the executive branch. And what is that necessary fence? He said in his last testimony before the Rules Committee, that necessary fence is anchored in the filibuster. Senator Schumer of New York, the checks and balances which have been at the core of this republic are about to be evaporated. This was in response to the Republicans who were trying to diminish the effectiveness of the filibuster. The checks and balances, Senator Schumer said, which say that if you get 51% of the vote, you don't get your way 100% of the time. Former Senator Clinton, Hillary Clinton, now Secretary of State, you've got majority rule. Then you've got the Senate over here, Senator Clinton said, where people can slow things down, where they can debate, where they have something called the filibuster. You know, it seems like it's a little less than efficient, said Senator Clinton. Well, that's right, it is, she said, and deliberately designed to be so. Senator Dodd, more recently, I'm totally opposed to the idea of changing the filibuster rules. I think that's foolish in my view. Senator Byrd, that's why we have a Senate, to amend and debate freely. Senator Dodd, I can understand the temptation to change the rules that make the Senate so unique and simultaneously so terribly frustrating. But whether such temptation is motivated by a noble desire to speed up the legislative process or by pure political expediency, I believe such changes would be unwise. Senator Dodd, therefore, to my fellow senators who've never served a day in the minority, I urge you to pause in your enthusiasm to change Senate rules. And just two more. Senator Reid, who was then the Democratic leader but the minority leader, the filibuster, Senator Reid said in 2005, is far from a procedural gimmick. It's part of the fabric of this institution that we call the Senate. For 200 years, we've had the right to extend the debate. It's not a procedural gimmick. Some in this chamber want to throw out 214 years of Senate history in the quest for absolute power. They want to do away with Mr. Smith, as depicted in that great movie, being able to come to Washington. They want to do away with the filibuster. Senator Reid says they think they're wiser than our founding fathers. I doubt that's true. And then there was one other senator who spoke and who said this. The senator from Illinois, Senator Obama, quote, then if the majority chooses to end the filibuster, he was speaking of Republicans, if they choose to change the rules and put an end to the Democratic debate, then the fighting and the bitterness and the gridlock will only get worse. To me, the uniqueness of the Senate, well, let me put it this way. I think the last 2 years have been an aberration. And I'm coming to my question to the senator from Iowa. We've had no incentive for the majority to take the ideas of the minority, because the majority had these huge majorities and nearly 60 votes here and a Democratic president. So that when Senator Corker, my colleague from Tennessee, began to work on financial regulation bill, there came a time in the process where the Democrats just said, well, you know, we like Corker, and he's got some good ideas, but we don't need his vote to pass this bill. We've got the votes. We won the election. We'll write the bill. And so we had no consensus. We had a Democratic bill. We had a Democratic health care bill. We had a Democratic stimulus bill. You might have had one or two Republicans vote for it. And so for the last 2 years, we haven't had any experience in working across party lines. I mean, what the filibuster does is say, you're not going to pass the Senate anything, unless at least some Republicans and some Democrats agree, unless you get a consensus. And then that changes behavior. And people say, okay, let's bring No Child Left Behind bill to the floor. But it's got to have Senator Enzi and Senator Harkin, or it's not going anywhere because it's got to have 60 votes. What's the advantage of that? The advantage of that is the comparison of the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 and the health care law of 2009. In 1964, after a bitter fight, led by Senator Russell of Georgia, the Civil Rights Bill passed, overcoming a filibuster. The bill was written in the Republican leader's office. It wasn't just sent over there in the middle of Christmas. It was written in his office. And so you had President Johnson, the Democrat, Senator Dirksen saying, this is good for the country, and a lot of people hated the bill. Some people thought it didn't go far enough, but they didn't. They hated the bill. What did Senator Russell do, who'd fought that bill for his whole term here? He went home to Georgia and said, I did everything I could to stop it, but it's the law, and we must obey it. So not only do we need a consensus to get a better bill, we need a bill that the country will accept. Compare that to the health care law. There's a lot of good intentions went into the health care law. I know that. Senator Harkin was in the middle of that. But the fact of the matter was it was a Democratic bill. It was rammed through Christmas Eve in the middle of the night, you know, after we barely had a chance to look at it. Solely partisan votes. And what happened? Instead of everybody going home and say it's the law of the land, we support it, it caused an instant movement to repeal it and replace it. So I hope that we will not do what Senator Harkin suggests. I mean, I think his proposal is, well, we're going to hang you, but we'll either hang you in 3 days instead of tonight. I mean, we'll narrow it down. I mean, that's a little worse. We know that if you got 51 votes, you can pass it. So if the House of Representatives over here passes a bill, a Republican House, to repeal the health care law, you know if we've got 51 votes over here, we'll do it too. Or if the Democratic House, as they did last year, passes a bill to repeal the ballot and secret elections, if the Democrats have 51 votes over here, they'll do it too. But when it requires a consensus, if bills like that come from the House to the Senate, we say, whoa, let's think this over. And we don't pass it. We don't pass it unless we have some kind of consensus. Now, that doesn't mean all the Republicans and all the Democrats. On the tax agreement that just was passed, we had almost all the Republicans and some of the Democrats. On the New START treaty, we had almost all the Democrats and some of the Republicans. But at least you had substantial consensus from both parties, and I think the country respects and appreciates that, and I think the framers knew what they were doing when they created a majoritarian House. In other words, the freight train can run through whatever the election is, and a different kind of Senate. And the different kind of Senate, as Senator Byrd eloquently has said, and I think the senator from Kansas will probably address this, has been one where we can say, you're not going to pass anything unless we do it together. That's called consensus. That's called cooperation. I think the American people would be greatly relieved. Now, my question that I'd like to pose through the chair to Senator Harkin, and then I'll sit down, and I know the senator from Kansas, senator from Tennessee is here. You know, just what is a filibuster? Senator Sanders was on the floor for several hours on the tax debate the other day. He spoke for 8 or 9 hours. I guess that's a filibuster in the traditional sense, but I think the kind of filibuster that the senator from Iowa is counting is, let's say Senator Reid brings a health care bill to the floor, and I rush over here and say, I've got an amendment to the health care bill. And Senator Reid says, sorry, I'm going to cut off your amendment. I object. That's a filibuster. You know, if we're just talking and amending and debating, that's not a filibuster. It's not a filibuster until the majority leader cuts it off. So what they're counting as filibusters is the number of times the Democrats have cut us off from doing what we're supposed to do, which is amend and debate. It's like being invited to sing on the Grand Ole Opry and then coming up there and you're not allowed to sing. I mean, people in Tennessee don't expect me to come up here and sit on a log just because no matter how distinguished the majority leader is, he might say, well, I don't want your amendments. What was traditional in the Senate is that senators came in almost any time with almost any amendment on almost any bill. And in the days of Senator Byrd and Senator Baker, they'd have 300 amendments, and they'd start voting. And some would say, well, it's Thursday, don't we go home? And they'd say, no, we're going to vote unless you want to give up your amendments. But we didn't vote on one Friday this past year. And a lot of senators on both sides of the aisle don't want to vote on controversial issues. If we look for consensus, if we were willing to vote on controversial issues, Mr. President, And if we ended the 3-day work week, if the majority thinks the minority is abusing the filibuster, they can confront it. They can sit over there and they can say to us, okay, Senator Alexander, if you're going to, in a post-cloture time, if 60 of us are ready to cut this off, we're ready to get on to a vote. So you got 7 hours that you can speak, and then you got to get 23 other senators to take the other hour. And if you stop talking, we're going to put the question. And we've got some motions that we can make about your being dilatory. In other words, we can make life miserable for you because we're going to do this all night long. You do this about once or twice. As Senator Byrd said in his last testimony, the rules exist today to confront a filibuster. So my question to the senator from Iowa that I would pose through the chair is, what is a filibuster? Is it a filibuster when I come down to the floor to amend the health care bill and the majority leader says, sorry, I'm going to use my powers to cut it off, you can't amend the bill, and then he files cloture? That's a filibuster. That's what he calls a filibuster, I think. What I call it is cutting off my right to amend, right to debate, right to do my job.
President.
Senator from Iowa.
First of all, I respond to my friend from Tennessee who makes cogent arguments, as he always does. And he is a good friend of mine, and we've worked together on a lot of things. And I hope this is the beginning of some colloquies we can have here. I do want to indulge and let other senators have their say because they were so kind to let me have my say, too. But I intend to be here as long as anybody wants to say or to engage in some colloquies here on the Senate floor. But I say to my friend from Tennessee that as I listened to him, and I did very carefully, there's just a couple things I just want to point out in terms of this idea of a filibuster and being able to amend things. My friend referred many times to the health care bill. And I don't know if my friend said this, but I've heard it said that we wrote it behind closed doors and all that kind of stuff. But let me just point out that when it came to our committee, the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, we had 13 days of markup, 54 hours. We allowed any amendment to be offered. Senator is a member of that committee. We allowed any senator to offer any amendment on our committee. We adopted 161 Republican amendments, either through some votes, which they won, or through just adopting the amendments. And yet after that, after all that, all the Republicans voted no. That's fine. There's a lot of times I know in the past when I have had an amendment on a bill, which I thought improved it, but overall I didn't like the bill, so I voted against it. I think that's the right of the minority. But then to obstruct it and to try to obstruct it to keep it from even being enacted, I don't think is right. So I would say to my friend that I don't think the health care bill is a really good example. I say to my friend that said something about, he quoted someone, I think maybe it may have been Senator Reid, saying that do people think they're wiser than our founding fathers? Please show me where our founding fathers ever set up a system where the Senate could have unlimited debate. They never did that. It's not in the Constitution. As I pointed out, the first Senate actually had the motion, the previous question, to cut off debate. And they didn't set up a majoritarian House. Article 1, Section 5, I say to my friend from Tennessee, Article 1, Section 5 is very clear. Each House sets up its rules. If the new majority in the House wanted to, they could set up rules to be like the Senate. They could do that. They could set up rules however they wanted, as long as they were constitutional. I suppose someone could take it to court to see if it was constitutional or not. But they don't have to operate under those rules. And we don't have to operate under these rules. The Constitution gives us the right to change those rules. So when you say why isn't our founding fathers never set up this system, by the way, never. There's no mention of it anywhere in the Constitution. And they did not set up a majoritarian House. They set up Article 1, Section 5, which said each House can set up its own rules. But then in the Constitution, they outlined certain prerogatives. The Senate has certain prerogatives. The House has certain prerogatives, like, for example, all bills of revenue have to originate in the House, not in the Senate. Treaties are done by the Senate, not by the House. but they never set up any kind of majoritarian type of thing. And I say to my friend that on this thing on a filibuster, I think there's a reason for a filibuster. I think there ought to be filibusters. I think there ought to be times when the minority can slow things down in order to get their views heard, or in order for them to be able to offer amendments to make the bill better in their views. That's the right of the minority. I don't think it's the right of any minority. When I say minority, when I say that, I'm not talking about Republicans. I'm saying any minority here. I don't think it's the right of any minority here to say, if I don't get my way, I'm going to stop everything. But that's kind of what I see happening around here. If I don't get my way, or if one senator can stop things. I point out one other bill I say to my friend from Tennessee that I thought was a great bipartisan bill. We worked hard on it in our committee. The senator from Tennessee was very instrumental, and that was the food safety bill. We reported out of our committee a year ago in November, unanimous vote. We didn't even have, everyone voted for it, Republicans and Democrats on our committee. We got it out, but there were some things in the bill that senators not on our committee, and maybe one senator on our committee didn't like, so we had to work through the ensuing months to get everybody on board and to work it out, which is fine. I have no problems with that. That's the legislative process. I've got patience. As my friend from Kansas knows, I have a lot of patience working on farm bills. Take time. But we worked it all out. And yet one senator who really disagreed with it, was able to hold it up from coming on the floor. Now, we finally got it on the floor. But it took almost a year. But one senator was able to do that. So I say one senator should be able to have the right to offer amendments, to be heard, but not to stop everything. And I guess that's what I come down to. I say to my friend from Tennessee that there ought to be I think there's a reason, and a good reason, for the Senate to be that saucer that cools things down, that story about Jefferson and Washington. But it should be at some point in time where the majority has not only the authority but the power to act after a due consideration and a due period of time. And I believe, I say to my friend in all sincerity, I believe that will promote more compromise than the present system. You may disagree with me. I'm just saying I feel that would. I'm not trying to take away compromise. I believe in compromise. I believe in working things out. As chairman of the Agriculture Committee for 2 farm bills, we worked things out. Now, I'm sure there were things in the farm bill that the senator from Kansas didn't like, and there were things in there that I didn't like, even though I was chairman. But you work these things out, compromise, and you get things done. Have here now, and that escalating arms race is doing away with that spirit of compromise and working things out and moving things. And that's why I think we have to change the rules. That's why I don't know if I adequately responded to my friend from Tennessee, but these were just my thoughts at the end, and I'm looking forward to other comments from other senators and engaging in other colloquies, and I promise I won't take so long.
Mr. President.
Senator from Kansas.
Mr. President, I understand that we are in a parliamentary situation where there is a colloquy, and that I don't know whether the Senator Alexander is yielding the time to me, or we're just having...
Mr. President, in fact, we don't have a colloquy. We just have sort of an informal understanding, and I believe the senator from Kansas has the floor.
Senator from Kansas does have the floor.
Mr. President, thank you, and thank you to my colleagues for their pertinent and very necessary remarks as we go forward with this. Matter of fact, the senator from Iowa said that in the past that he had entered into a colloquy with his colleagues on our side of the aisle in the past, where they even wandered over into each other's pasture. So I'm going to put down the microphone for a moment. To speak from right here in this gesture of bipartisanship, to jump the fences of partisanship and these tactics that we are debating on how we can improve the Senate. I know we've heard a lot of talk about Robert C. Byrd, a very beloved individual, and I know the acting presiding officer is very close to the former senator. But at any rate, it was the last time that Bob Byrd spoke publicly, either on the Senate or in committee, when he rose to the occasion in a very passionate way. And the chairman, of course, Chuck Schumer, the senator from New York, with great deference, recognized the senator. We were all on the edge of our chairs, as I recall that. And the senator from Tennessee has already gone over what Senator Byrd said at that time and then previously to that. But I remember when I first came to the Senate, and it was almost required, well, it was required, that we sort of go to school. And Senator Byrd, even though I had been in the House 16 years and thought I knew something, and he recognized that fact, and but he talked to us, and all of the freshmen at that particular time are the new members. The keeper of the institutional flame was the tag I put on Senator Byrd, and my wife Frankie and I became very close friends of the senator. He was very fond of Frankie, and he sort of put up with me. But at any rate, and he recounted that story that you attributed to Jefferson and to Washington, but I think it was really more attributable to Robert C. Byrd, because he would tell every incoming class that the role of the House, the People's House, and that perhaps what happened when they put the coffee pot on in regards to legislation, that coffee was so hot that it would boil over, and that it was the Senate's duty to act as the saucer, if you will, as the folks did back in West Virginia in earlier days, or Kansas, or Iowa, or Tennessee, or Texas, that they would pour the coffee out in the saucer, let it cool off a little bit, so you could put your biscuit in and then you could actually eat it, or the legislation would pass. And then you said, I think to me just a little while ago, that the real problem was that you didn't think it was really necessary to throw the coffee pot out the window. So you ended up with no legislation. Well, the problem is that sometimes on our side, maybe we want coffee, maybe we want tea, maybe we want to start over. And I think the senator from Tennessee basically hit the nail on the head here with three. My goodness, if we're going to talk about, getting things done or not getting things done, but there are three massive things that have happened in regards to legislation. I say massive. They are so comprehensive, so overwhelming that we're now just learning what they're about: the Financial Regulatory Reform, the Health Care Act, and the stimulus. Now, the Health Care Act, I just have a personal feeling about that, in that I had 11 amendments, all on rationing, all, by the way, worried about the confirmation that didn't happen in regards to Dr. Donald C. Berwick, who is the head of CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And we plan to ask a lot of questions about the doctor, because the statements he made in the past, obviously that confirmation did not happen, and he was a recess appointment. That's something I think we ought to deal with as well. But I had 11 amendments, all on rationing. There it was, 12:30 in the morning in the Finance Committee. And I had 11, and finally we got to the last two, and I said, why don't we consider them en bloc? I had about a minute or two to explain each amendment. They were voted down automatically. It was on a party line vote. And by the time we got to 12:30 or 1 o'clock in my amendments, why, there were a lot of people that, you simply hand over your vote to somebody else and they will vote you in regards to the fact that you're absent, i.e. they had a lot of proxies. So there weren't too many in the room. But I noticed that Senator Schumer was in the room, so I just stuck one of his bills that didn't make it along with my two, or my additional bill, and it was defeated on a party line vote. And then I said, well, how on earth do we get this problem of rationing solved, at least in my mind? And it simply didn't happen. And then I let Senator Schumer know that we had defeated his amendment as well. Wasn't too happy with that, but it just showed you that the process had broken down to the point that even in committee, if you had 2 amendments, if you had 5, if you had 11, you were simply ignored. Then that bill came to the floor, as you have indicated, and it worked its way. And I think since the senator from Tennessee brought up the fact of the Grand Ole Opry, I thought it was making a bill behind closed doors. That's a famous country western song, and we didn't like that process over here at all. And now you're seeing an effort to repeal the bill and also an effort to try to fix it if we possibly can. I'm not as upset about that as some people are, because I think that we can really get to the proper kind of debate. I finally had only one other recourse, that was to go to the reconciliation process, which I know you know that was not going to be successful, but we had I had three votes, and all were defeated, and that's when everybody is milling about. By the way, Robert C. Byrd would not really permit that at all. He would call for regular order, and that would happen. But there I'm stuck in regards to my main concerns about the health care bill were not allowed, as far as I was concerned, on the floor of the Senate. And that has happened a lot. I'm not going to go into the quotes by Senator Byrd. That's already been done by Senator Alexander. But I would like to quote Senator Dodd in his valedictory speech. The history of this young democracy, the framers decided, should not be written solely in the hand of the majority. This isn't about the filibuster. That's the most important statement he made. What will determine whether this institution works or not is whether each of the 100 senators can work together. Well, how can we do that? Well, here's a classic example. Right before Christmas, we were going right up to the end, unfortunately, as usual, and there were several bills that the majority wanted to pass without allowing the minority and the American people to debate or amend them. So the tree was filled, and that's the legislative language to say, I'm sorry, but we're going to cut off debate. 98 times in the 110th Congress that happened. The moment the question was raised on the floor before a debate was even allowed to take place. So on one hand, you can talk about filibusters. The other hand is filling the tree or not allowing members to offer amendments. The senator from Tennessee offered the classic example. Let's go back here just a few days ago when we were right before Christmas. And the DREAM Act was a House bill that I know that the Senate leadership here wanted to pass it. Never had a legislative hearing in the House, never had a markup in the House. Its various Senate versions have never had a legislative hearing. A Senate version of the DREAM Act had not had a markup since 2003. In some, the DREAM Act, a controversial measure with very passionate beliefs on both sides of the aisle and within the parties as well, had not had an amendment offered to it in either the House of Congress, in either houses of Congress, either the committees or on the floor. Now, some may believe that the DREAM Act is perfect, or certainly is the best bill possible, and would not need any amendments to improve it, but obviously our constituents don't feel that way, and it's a very controversial bill. But instead of addressing their concerns, the majority shut down debate and amendments, and in the process shut down the rights of Americans to be heard. As a result, the minority refused to end debate, and obviously there was a filibuster. So it would be interesting to know the 275 times that bills have been filibustered, what was being filibustered. And in this particular case, I think we did it the wrong way. But how about this? And this gets to my question. Contrast this with the approach taken on the 9/11 bill, which the majority sought to pass just a few days later. The goal of providing help to the victims of 9/11 is one that members of both parties shared, but Senate Republicans noted that that particular version of the bill that Senate Democrats supported was problematic in regards to how much money we were spending and certainly could need improvement. So we insisted on having our concerns addressed. Most of them were addressed with a revised bill on which we did provide input. That bill passed the Senate by unanimous consent. And even the proponents of the original legislation would admit that the final bill is a better one and now enjoys broader support due to the minority's input. So what I think the majority needs to do is involve the minority like it did on the 9/11 bill, not shut us out, not shut us down like it did on the DREAM Act and other acts. And that would really present the case and the question I have to you. If that happened, if you wouldn't fill the tree, I think possibly 75%, 80% of the filibusters would probably go away. There are some that would like to filibuster anything, I know. But it gets back to what you said on why we're here. It's important to pass legislation. It's important, I know, to do that. But it's equally important to prevent bad legislation from passing, or if you have an alternative that you would like to offer, and at least have that, that ability. And the last 2 years, that process has simply broken down. Why not? Why not? Why can't we work together? Because that's what Senator Dodd said. He said whether each of the 100 senators can work together. That's what the question is about the filibuster. We can stop this business of secret holds. It seems to me we could have a timely pace on nominations. It seems to me that we could certainly end these recess appointments where people who should be confirmed have to go through the confirmation process, instead of all of a sudden parachuting somebody in who is very controversial. And now we have over 100,000 regulations pouring out of the Department of Health and Human Services, our entire health care providers throughout the nation. Iowa or in Tennessee, Kansas, wherever, are wondering what on earth is happening. And when I go home, I don't get the question of why a bill didn't pass or not. I get the question on what on earth are you guys doing back there, passing all the legislation with all the regulatory stuff that I have to put up with, and et cetera, et cetera. As a matter of fact, when they pose that question, I say I'm not a you guy, I'm an us guy. And so then we have a debate, but usually it's the debate that should have taken place here on the floor of the Senate, but we were not able to do so. So I guess the question I have for the distinguished senator from Iowa, and I appreciate his reference to our work in previous farm bills, we were able to work it out. It was very contentious. And sometimes the farm bill would come to the floor and it would take a week and a half. And then we'd have an appropriation bill, and then the appropriators would think they could rewrite the farm bill and take another week and a half. But we did it. We worked through it. Nobody just filled the tree and said, I'm sorry, you can't have that amendment. Now I'm making a speech instead of asking a question. I apologize for that. But I am in agreement on secret holds. I think there should be timely pace on nominations. I do think that we should go through the regular confirmation process. But I do feel, exactly as the senator from Tennessee has put out, that once you get on this business of ending the filibuster or going down in the number of requisite votes, you're on a slippery slide. And then you're into the tyranny of the majority, and that's not what the Senate is all about. So I will stop at this point and ask Senator from Iowa if he has any comments.
Mr. President, Madam President,